While Antaria's senses weren't quite as sharp above water as they were below, she was still more than capable of taking in the all-too-familiar acrid stench of oily smoke and melted metal. The shark-like Dixie woman felt her tail twist from side to side in contentment as she took in the aftermath of her regiment's most recent victory. They caught the Imperials completely by surprise, and now the landscape was littered with the remains of their soldiers and machines. Were it that I didn't have to share my victory with others, she thought, grey-skinned features twisting into a scowl as she watched a pair of roach pirates scrambling over the still smouldering hulk of an Imperial IFV in search of possible salvage. While she could well understand the reason for it, she still couldn't quite accept the aliens' actions. The dead deserved respect. The enemy had fought and died with honour. There was another unmistakable crackle of gunfire ran out from across the battlefield. She found she envied them that fact. She envied them the simplicity of it. They had died with an enemy before them and their allies beside, a clear-cut division between the two. Were that my own service was so simple, she thought. How is the mop-up proceeding? She asked, turning to her second. The other woman, a fellow at Dixie, the same as all her fellow soldiers that had joined her in this operation, stood crisply at attention. It proceeds at pace, the Major responded. Those units that escaped the initial engagement are quickly being run down by our exos, are expected to run into our other forces, who have just reported seizing control of the other two landing sites with minimal losses. Antaria nodded. Just as planned. Still, I hear some hesitance in your voice, Major. The woman shuffled a bit in place, head tendrils twitching in place as she suddenly shifted her weight from foot to foot, which was a signifier as great as any, as to just how uncomfortable the other woman was. Dixie did not shuffle. They stood straight, proud, at all times. It's the woman paused as another crackle rang out, a frown twisting her features. Not that Antaria blamed her for that. The lasers used by most species across the galaxy were all but silent when they fired, but the sound when they hit flesh, well, the pop was rather unmistakable. Still, they were soldiers, and were more than accustomed to that particular nuance of warfare. If Antaria were to guess, it was the context more than the sound that bothered her subordinate, which was a perfectly reasonable reaction. It bothered her, too. Which was why she had no patience for half-words or subterfuge, as she thought the silence that had grown between them. Skies above. Her day-to-day duties were filled with enough of that. The executions, she said simply, her tone as dry as possible to give no indications of her inner thoughts. The soldiers find it upsetting. The Major nodded. Is it causing delays? Antaria asked. Some, the woman admitted. Antaria sighed. She supposed she was fortunate in some ways. Had her regiment been composed of the usual multi-species ensemble, she might have feared outright refusals to the orders she had given. Fortunately for her, Dixie were more disciplined than that. Her people knew duty. Refusing an order just wasn't done in a Dixian society. Still, a soldier dragging her tail to carry out an unpopular order is a form of protest as old as time, she thought. Nothing we can do about it, beyond sending out another missive to our officers to remind the troops that our actions here might save billions of lives in time, Antaria sighed. A small sacrifice to our personal honour is nothing compared to that. Well, that and the knowledge that everyone present would likely face immediate execution should the Imperials ever get their hands on them. Executing prisoners of war tended to attract that sort of penalty, even if the two member states involved technically weren't at war. The thought of it was enough to make her head hurt. It was moments like this that made her wonder why she ever signed up for Alliance Black Ops. Oh, yeah, because of a sneaky young pup who thought she was hot shit, she thought. And that guys would be begging to fertilize her eggs when she heard she was an Alliance commando. Of course, it had never factored into her young, sex-addled brain that she would never be able to tell anyone what she did for a living. That had certainly been a disappointment. And I'm still here 10 years later because I'm dumbass at Dixie. We get a collective cultural wet cunt for a thankless duty, she thought. And because as much as I hate this fucking job, someone has to do it. She's seen far too much of this galaxy's dark underside to believe otherwise. Weak! Antaria frowned as a walking, talking example of said dark underside strode over to her. The speaker was pretty much exactly what one expected when you said the words periphery pirate. The Roach's warsuit was a mismatch of armor plating and vulgar imagery plated over what looked to have once been an old consortium deep-core mining suit. The only indication of the being within were the occasional tears in the synthetic fabric, for which Antaria could see the strange blue gelatinous creature that both inhabited and puppeteered the suit, as if it were its real body. "Click. To what do I owe the pleasure?" Antaria asked dryly. The service of the suit fairly arrived as the pirate commander made his displeasure known. "We came to make our report on our effort's success. The Allies' single minds hesitate weakness." Antaria frowned as she mentally passed the words of the alien, a feat made slightly harder by the fact that the roach-echoing voice sounded more like something approximating random noises in a particular order, rather than actual speech. Still, there was an opportunity to spear two fish with a single thrust. "If you feel like my people are not showing enough enthusiasm in combing the field of battle for survivors, then we are more than happy to leave the task of battlefield cleanup to you, while my regiment moves on to our next objective." "We do, acceptable." As expected, it took barely a moment for the creature to answer, no doubt born of a desire to loot the battlefield at his leisure, as much as take over the task of searching for survivors. Which was fine by Atraxia. Her orders might have mandated that she work closely with the pirates, but she'd be glad to see the back of them for a few hours. So it was with some relief that she watched the alien stomp off back to his own command post, loudly yelling commands to his fellows as it went. "Ill-disciplined cats," her major spat to the side once the alien was gone. Antaria couldn't find it in her to argue. For her and her fellow Dixie, war was a duty. For the Ulnus, though, it was personal. And when wars were personal, they got ugly. What was worse, she couldn't even really blame the slime-like creatures for being the way they were. Whatever culture they'd had before, it had long since been eroded by generations as galactic vagrants. Any sense of cultural identity had died when the Imperials destroyed their homeworld. Now the only thing any disparate group of Ulnans could be relied upon to have in common was an almost genetic hatred for Imperials. Storms. We better manage to keep them from fighting between themselves over salvage rights while we were waiting for the Imperial task force to arrive on Rakanos, she thought. A task made all the more difficult by the fact that the three Alliance regiments had been hidden beneath the ocean waves the entire time, which was part of the reason why only a Dixie had been pulled for the operation, given their aquatic nature. Still, as much as the Alliance colonel sympathized with the aliens, that was as far as her feelings on the matter went. Pitiable or not, the Roaches were walking, talking examples of why she and the rest of the Alliance Special Warfare Group were doing what they were doing. Because if the Imperial had their way, the Adixi, and every other race of the Alliance, would soon meet the same fate as the Roaches. Or humanity, she thought, mind returning to the task at hand. How long until Second Company has visual on Mining Nexus 5? The Major straightened up. Not more than a few hours, ma'am. Good. If the other two Alliance regiments on planet had imitated her movements, they'd have the Terran First effectively boxed in on all sides. 3 Alliance companies would be more than enough to hold the only remaining Imperial regiment in place until their parent regiment showed up. The only reason she didn't think her scouts would be able to wipe out the Imperials completely with that near parity in force was because of the Terrans' performance in the war thus far. Perhaps it was an overabundance of caution of the regiment's success against what was merely a bunch of pirates, but she'd informed her people to only engage if the Imperials tried to perform a breakout. Which they might attempt if they know we're coming, she thought. Which they will. Some units would have slipped through her encirclement, and while some of those would make for the other funnels and be swallowed by the Alliance regiments that had attacked there, at least one would likely head for the Nexus. Which meant that they had to expect the Terran First to be prepared for them. Which, as much as it aggravated Antaria to sound like a rear echelon asshole, would likely be for the better. After all, her people were here to test weapons and doctrines for effectual use against the Imperium, and some data for how those things performed against a ducking enemy without access to air support would be valuable to the people who would be analysing this operation exhaustively once her people returned. As callous as it sounded for her people to suffer more losses in the pursuit of statistics, a few extra deaths here could well save millions of lives in the war to come. That was her burden and her duty. Still, duty or not, it did little to make her feel any better about the fact that she'd been slaughtering thousands of human men and women who were as much victims of the Imperium as anyone else. Ones who by all accounts have proven exemplary warriors, she thought, and definitely not the ones I would have preferred to be forewarned of our arrival. Their performance against the Roaches had definitely solidified them as something of a wild card in the minds of the Alliance commanders present. Which was why, as another crackle rang out, Antaria momentarily considered sending a message to General Gablia to rescind the no prisoners mandate. Then she shook her head as a Dixie discipline overrode that compulsion. Damn the Imperium for making me do this, she thought, as she clambered out of the rain and back into her command vehicle. Fucking Alliance, Graham cursed mentally. Always sticking their snouts where it's not wanted. Rebellions, pirates, accidents. Some days it seemed like almost every burning pile of shit in the galaxy had the Alliance at the centre of it, all in the name of desperately trying to stave off Imperial galactic dominance. Not that they'd ever have the tits to come out and actually say that, she thought. Then she might have been able to respect them. As misguided fools, perhaps, but ones with principles. But no. They hid behind treaties and politics, all the while turning the rest of the galaxy into a volatile minefield of violence and tribalism. Because they knew that if the day ever came when the Imperium and the Alliance went head-to-head, in a true battle, one that really tested the mettle of a nation, that the Imperium would come out victorious. Bring us up to date, Major, Claire's voice called out, returning Graham's attention to the holographic display in front of her. Though she made sure to shuffle a little as she did, so that those officers behind her could also see. A requirement, given that the command room was positively packed with bodies. Not only was Clef's senior command staff present, but a good number of the regiment's officer corps was too. It struck Graham as a bit of an odd move on her colonel's part, but perhaps the woman felt it beneficial for all her officers to see firsthand the information that was about to be conveyed, if only as a reminder of what they were up against, and what fate awaited all of them if they failed. Puta gave an acknowledging nod before she began. Based on information recovered from survivors of attacks that took place within the last 24 hours, and our own returning scout unit's reports, we have come to the conclusion that for all intents and purposes, the 198th and 20th Divisions no longer exist as military entities or otherwise. There was a palpable intake of breath as each person absorbed the news. In the centre of the table, the holographic display showed the two blue symbols representing Allied forces positioned on, or just outside, the funnels being caught between the familiar red symbols of the Roach forces and a number of new black icons. The blue icon shrunk in size massively, past breaking off in very different directions, turning grey as an acknowledgement of those being their last known positions before contact was lost. A precious few of those blue icons made their way directly to the Terran First's own position at Mining Nexus 5, which was now the only remaining blue icon on the map, and sat squarely between the three new black contacts. Empress, someone muttered quietly behind her. 2 whole regiments? Gremp turned a stern gaze on the speaker, one of her own exopilots, to her irritation, silencing the woman. Though it wasn't as if she didn't understand the sentiment. The Imperium wasn't accustomed to losses. One didn't maintain or expand a galaxy-spanning empire without them. Compared to the size of the Imperial military as a whole, 2 regiments amounted to less than a drop in the bucket. Still, she found she couldn't totally recall any occasion in recent memory in which 2 entire regiments had been lost in their totality. Not since the early days of the periphery conflicts, certainly, she thought. Though unreliable, current casualty estimates range from somewhere between 8 and 12,000, Puta continued, including all accompanying vehicles and exos. We anticipate more survivors with access to motorized transport to reach our position over the next 2 days, but any after that are likely to be cut off by Alliance fast movers that have been observed attempting to encircle our position. Claire's talons tapped against the glass of the display. Have we any guesses as to the composition of our foes? Not just these fast movers, but their parent regiments? Puta glanced at Davila, who tapped a few keys on her on-the-pad. Instantly, the display switched to a number of different helmet cam shots, each one displaying a different machine or vehicle. To the right of each was a list of facts and figures, though Graham couldn't help but note that said figures were more than a little sparse on details, with wide deviations in details like assumed armor thickness and vehicle speed. Avila spoke up. 3 mechanized regiments of the Guppy Private Military Company, as an Alliance-based and assumedly backed company with strong ties to the Alliance Strategic Warfare Group, it can be safely assumed that much of their equipment imitates that of the newly forming Alliance Standardized Military. In simple terms, please, Clef drawled. The plant woman flushed a little before gamely continuing. Assuming Dixie small arms and infantry armor, Gren IFVs, and Klek exos. Great. The worst of all worlds, Gren felt like muttering. The Alliance standardized military have been a joke for a long time. To most Imperial onlookers, it seemed like the member states of the Alliance could barely decide on what uniform said military should wear, let alone get around to actually forming it. Well, it seemed the joke was on the Imperium now, because the bureaucrats had actually made some pretty decent choices. Well, with the notable exception of the Klek Exos, she supposed. They haven't updated that design in... And I'm afraid it gets worse, Porter continued, talking over for a villa. As she spoke, the holographic display changed to that of an Exo diving atop of an Imperial IFV. That's not a swoop heavy, Clef said, eyeing the machine that only had a passing resemblance to that of the ancient Klek Exo design. Meets what we have now designated the Swoop Heavy A1. Clearly based on the Swoop Heavy chassis, the alternative one seems to be an altogether different beast. From what we have been able to piece together from footage from our survivors, the new machine possesses two 2mm lasers located in the torso, with another 5mm rotary cannon located in the right arm. Finally, it possesses two micro-rocket batteries in each shoulder. Empress above, Grant hissed, a sentiment echoed by many of her fellow pilots behind her. Her own Exo was Imperial Standard, which meant a single 5mm rotary in the right arm, and a micro-rocket pod in the left shoulder. Fortunately, there does seem to be a trade-off for the machine's increased firepower. She pointed at the picture. Observe the noticeably thinner armor around the cockpit and legs compared to the base design. One of the pilots who managed to escape from the attack on the 198th claimed to have brought one down from up to 300 meters away using a 5mm cannon with only a 2-second burn time on target. Our engineers have also theorized that the alternate one will have a significantly shorter operational window compared to its predecessor. Graham raised her hand to ask a question, only for Pooter to preempt her. You will be able to interview that pilot once this meeting is complete. Graham settled back down, satisfied. She wasn't exactly happy that the Klek had apparently updated their Exos to fall in line with a more modern doctrine, but she was happy that the new alternate wouldn't be quite as much of a pain in the ass to peel open like the old Swoop Heavy was. Estimate of enemy strength? Clef asked. Anywhere from 10,000 to 14,000 Alliance troops, 120 IFVs, and 180 Exos. Our strength? 672 direct combat infantry, 83 IFVs, 105 Exos, and 36 tanks. Clef went silent for a moment. Well, she said slowly, it seems we're in luck, ladies. There'll be plenty of action for all of us. The laughter that followed was more nervous than amused.